Okay, going through the agenda, the next spot is we're going to go through ETDM. I'm going to give an overview of just what ETDM is, the process in general, and then Ruth's going to come on and take over for Turnpike specific tasks. She's going to look at planning versus programming, managing projects through a programming screen, how you know you've got the right project, how do you interact with people, how do you summarize reports, what's the difference between state and federal projects in ETDM, and then going forward as you get into PD&E, how you can utilize the information coming out of those summary reports to help scope your project by having a good resource with a lot of good documented coordination. So that said, I'm going to go ahead and go through the ETDM, and when we switch over to Ruth, when we switch over to the Turnpike specific tasks, she'll take over from there. So starting with the overview, obviously we've got the transportation project development process. You guys are all aware, planning, PD&E, design, right-of-way, and construction. That red box is kind of showing you where ETDM, which is efficient transportation decision making, it's one of the department's implementations for basically pre-NEPA or pre-PD&E, also known as PEL, which is planning and environmental linkages. And it's a way that we work together with our partners, the public, our state, our federal partners, to kind of look at our proposed projects ahead of time so that we can start figuring out whether or not we've got some good projects. We're looking at supporting cost feasible plans, and it's very helpful to have everybody engaged so that you can figure out that if you're going to be being held in a cost feasible plan, that means you have to have the revenue to support the project. Well, if you think you've got a project that is $10 million, but you go out and you review it and you find out it's $100 million, the amount of money that people have to hold to move that project forward, in that case, is very different than what they were estimating. And it could really be much bigger projects. It could be 100 million up to $1 billion, which is kind of more in line with what we're doing today on some of these larger projects. So anyway, the point is we go through these screening events, these opportunities to engage the public and our state partners and our federal partners and the tribes to kind of look initially at some project ideas that have a purpose and need, some general alignment or corridor alignment, and some potential locations where these proposed transportation improvement projects would go, and get some feedback from those partners on those specific alternative corridors that are being evaluated or the specific project information that's being evaluated to ultimately help us determine, do we have a good project? Do we need to go back to the drawing board? Or are there things we haven't considered before? So that when we move over into the PD&E stage, we've got some well-vetted transportation improvement projects with a lot of coordination. We have a pretty firm understanding of, if there's going to be consultation, what kind of consultation, if we're going to need sign-off from folks, what type of technical studies are we going to need, how are we going to build the scope for the project, and ultimately, what environmental document is it going to be? Is this something that can be done as a categorical exclusion? In Florida, we have a type 2. Yes, that's a federal process, and in Turnpike, you guys do a lot of SEERs that could be different levels of equal to a type 2 all the way up to an EIS. But all that early coordination really helps us figure out, well, what needs to be in the document? What do we need to spend more time in detail on, and what can we not spend a lot of time in detail on? So a lot of what we're doing very early on is we're looking at feasibility. We're working with our partners. The big thing I always talk about with ETDM is that the reason we're engaging everybody is we're trying to avoid and minimize impact, and ultimately, if something's unavoidable, we'll work to identify what our mitigation options or strategies are early on if it looks like we may encounter that. But what I talk about with folks is that through ETDM, it's really kind of, we're putting lines in pencil, or we're drawing polygons in pencil, and we're working with folks to figure out, is that the right spot? Do we need to avoid, move things to the left or the right? Do we need to go 100 feet? Do we need to identify some resources that we really want to make sure we don't want to come in contact with? And how we engage folks is we ask them to help us, move the lines or move the polygons at a point in time where the stuff's drawn in pencil. A lot of times before this process was in place, we came to them at the tail end where a lot of the decisions had been made. The line work was really done in pen at that point. It took a lot of work, and it made a lot more sense to work together early so that if we can know about the things we need to avoid and minimize impact to, we can do that thoughtfully before we move into design. By working together, we can focus our topics on what we need to look at. Is there going to be a wetlands issue we're going to need to address? In Florida, probably yes. But what about historical and archaeological stuff? Is the alternative we're looking at, are we in good shape there? What about relocations? All of those various elements that we all get to be transportation professionals. There's so many things we have to juggle, and what's important in that specific location could be very different than what's really important in another specific location. So we want to make sure we've got a good sense of what's happening in all those locations. Obviously, we want to be able to build a good project and something that can be done in PD&E, understanding what our class of action is going to be, the intended level of the documentation, the types of coordination. That all helps us make sure we've got the right people, the right staff hours, the right length of time it's going to take to resolve that. And if needed, we've got some mechanisms in place to help with issue resolution between all the parties to make sure we're on the same page. Now, how we do that is we complete what we call screening events within ETDM. We have a planning screen and we have a programming screen. And in that planning screen, we're kind of really looking out for projects that have been identified and should be going into those cost feasible plans for our MPOs and ourselves to, again, get a sense of, is this a good project? Are there any critical flaws? Are there things that we're not considering yet? Because again, reserving 100 million to potentially move the project is very different than holding $1 billion. If all of a sudden this project comes in, you think, you're thinking 100 million and it's going to be $1 billion, you may want to rethink your priorities. And so that planning screen is really intended to help the planning community understand, what the potential impacts could be with the project as proposed. So they can do a lot of things. They could take that information and they can then refine it as you move from a planning screen later on to a programming screen, or you could put it on hold and work on other priorities. Then we have a programming screen. That programming screen is an annual screening event for projects that have been identified by the locals or ourselves that are considered to be priority projects that we want to move forward into the environmental document stage over these next few years. We want to be able to start kicking off the process. So we're going to be sending out the purpose and need, but we're going to be asking for the lead agency to approve the purpose and need. We're going to be sending out our AN package to get that process kicked off. We're going to be identifying, alternatives that could be potentially eliminated. We're going to identify, what technical studies should be advanced, what PD&E activities are we going to be engaging in, what PD&E activities do we not need to be engaging in. We're documenting all of those interactions so that we can publish a summary report that then becomes the foundation for our project development and environmental, our PD&E phase as we move forward. And of course, we're documenting all the coordination throughout. So what goes through ETDM? It's not everything, right? Because part of what we're doing in ETDM, and I'll show you on the next slide, is that in Florida, we actually have agreements, funding and operating agreements with our state and federal partners. And in many cases, we actually provide federal agency dollars to our state and federal partners to provide expedited review on our projects. One of the things when ETDM was first started was, yes, we need to have folks engaged early so they can help us shape the project rather than tell us about all the changes that need to happen when we're ready to ask for a permit. And part of that coordination of we need to know your answer earlier so that we don't make huge changes later is that they needed to also have some resources in place that could engage us at the point they needed to engage us. So we worked with them and through Federal Highway to provide federal funds to our state and federal partners so that they would engage on our timeline. Now, we're not paying for their answer, but we're paying for their response on time and their access. So the types of things that we're going to engage all of those folks together on, and we call collectively those folks the ETAT, the Environmental Technical Advisory Team. We don't pull them together for everything. If you think about what the department does, in any given year, 85% of the environmental documents are, either type 1 categorical exclusions, which is a categorical exclusion for federal documents, or they're non-major state actions, which is the state equivalent for categorically excluded levels of work. And then there's the other 15% that can be broken up into, in Florida for the federal, the type 2 categorical exclusion, the EAs, which is the environmental assessment, and then the EISs. And progressively, the type 2 is very close in categorical exclusion, but requires a little bit more work, but the outcome is going to be that the project will not have significant impact on the resources. You're going to do an EA, which basically takes twice as long because you have a question of significance, and you guys will get a lot more detail on this whole concept of significance throughout the rest of the training. But there's a question, so you got to do a lot more research to find out the answers to those questions. Or there's an EIS, which is even probably double what the EA level of effort is, but you're resulting in a significant impact to a potential resource. And for each one of those classes of action, there's a different level of analysis, a different level of work. So this early coordination with these partners help us to avoid and minimize impacts. And so if you're avoiding and minimizing impacts, that also helps us remove that, potential for significance, to have that significant impact on those resources. So that's one of the big reasons why we're doing that. And this list you see on the screen is all the qualifying projects. So you're looking at the roadway projects, you're thinking about additional lanes, additional roadway, additional freeway, providing new access in a new area, a new beltway, new passenger rail, things like that. So we're not engaging everybody on the things we would do as a type 1, the things we would do as a non-major state action. But if we're doing it as a SEER, if we're doing it as a type 2, an EA, or an EIS, those are projects that we would expect to go through the screening event. And this next screen just kind of gives you a high-level shot on who is part of the technical advisory team. You'll notice we've got the federal agencies listed, we've got the tribes, a couple of the tribes listed, we have the state agencies listed as well as the local government. So that means for everybody you see on the screen, they're either actively participating in this process, we have a funding agreement where we're providing resources for the level of engagement in our processes, or there's an agency operating agreement, which there could, in some cases, just be an agency operating agreement. We do have some state agency partners that said we don't need any additional federal dollars to engage in, the Florida Department of Transportation's early engagement efforts to screen transportation projects. So people like DEP, they participate 100% on all of our projects. We don't give them any money. They just operate with us as a sister agency. Many of the water management districts are like that as well. St. Johns River participates on their own dime. And then we also have some of the federal agencies that do the same thing. National Park Service does it on their own dime, but we have an agency operating agreement with them. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, we do have an agency operating agreement and funding agreement for those folks. So there's lots of different ways that we have folks engaged throughout the process. And if we think about those agencies, all of those folks, they're all looking at the world from a different lens, right? They all have different legislation and requirements for what their agency's kind of role and responsibility is. Maybe they're looking at essential fish habitat if they're National Marine Fisheries Service. Maybe they're focused on the physical environment. Maybe they're focusing on contamination or social cultural effects. All of these agencies are providing considerations to our transportation project sponsor on what this proposed project will do to the things that are important to their agency. So in those agreements with those ETAD agencies, we actually map out and identify what are their authorities that their agency works under, and we map that to issues or topic areas within ETDM and the environmental screening tool, so that we can make sure that their agency actually provides us comments relative to their jurisdiction and authority on that proposed project and or alternatives that get released. The other thing that's great about those screening events that go out is in the previous process, when you were developing a project, you would work with each agency individually, and some of those engagements would, be very linear, and some would only take a short period of time, and some of them would take a long period of time. In this screening event concept, we engage them all simultaneously, and they're all on the same timeline. For instance, in the screening events themselves, when we put in a purpose and need, and we digitize the line work, and we put in polygons, and we kind of develop what we call PEDs, which are preliminary environmental discussions, which actually map really well back to these environmental considerations, where our own transportation team and our consultants look at the proposed line work and where it's going to fall and what resources it's coming in impact for, and we actually develop our own personal preliminary environmental determination. That's our way of communicating back to our partners on, yes, we've got this project in this area, here's the things we know about, and here's how we're expecting to handle it. And then we share that with them. And when a screening event starts, whether it's a planning or a programming screen, that information is available to those partners. And when they get a form and they get a notification that says a screening event has begun, and we ask them to start, doing their research and coming up with their agency's official commentary, they've got a spot where they put in their agency's official responses, and right above it is our preliminary environmental determination. So here's our assessment, and then we ask them to do their assessment, and part of what we ask them to do is confirm what we tell them. That's great news. Also tell us what we don't know, because if we don't know it, it's an important piece as well. But if we've done a really good job on the analysis, like we noticed that this important feature is out there, but we're not intending to hit it because we know that we're going to avoid it already, that's great information, so they don't tell us about the same feature. Again, we can already agree that we recognize that resource is important, and we're already putting things in place to make sure that we avoid it should this move forward. So this is overall important. You guys work with lots and lots of agencies on lots and lots of things. So those partners are providing their agency's official comments back to the department. And they do that, like I said, in the planning and the programming screen. And I hit on a lot of this in the beginning, so I won't stay too long. But again, planning screen is like, we've got big projects out there. We want to know if they're good projects. We want to start figuring out if there's any critical flaws. And every time they encounter something that was unexpected or a new resource is identified that they hadn't considered previously, what they really hear on their side is more dollar bills. And if there's more dollar bills, is this project still a good project? Do they need to go back and refine it? Or does it need to just sit on the shelf until they can get themselves a better project? But the programming screen, these are the priority projects that are coming up from our MPOs or the district. These are the ones, in the near time horizon that we are expecting to move forward with into the environmental document. So this switches from, it's still great if there are any new critical flaws since we've seen this last and there's new things out there that previously weren't considered. Critical flaw identification is always welcome. It's always better to find out at this stage than to find out later. But it's also a point in time where we're kind of prepping for the beginning of our PD&E. We're getting our advanced notification out and getting it cleared through the clearinghouse over at DEP. We're sharing this information with our partners because we're trying to figure out when we move into the PD&E what is the level of effort? What technical studies are we going to do? What level of study are we going to have to do? Are some of these studies going to be more extensive? What potential permits are being identified? What engagement? Are there any consultation that's required? And if so, is it formal? Is it not formal? All of these things help us figure out, as we're planning for the project, how much time, energy, and effort we're going to need to kind of move forward with that project. So when things go out for screening events, there's basically some key roles and some key players. We've talked about the ETAT quite a bit, so that's those agency folks that are out there. We ask them to be the single point of contact. We ask them to make sure that they're very well versed with their statutory and regulatory authority. And if things come up, they need to have access to their decision makers. They're kind of the conduit between us and their agency, and we use them all the time that way. There are also a few other folks that are key players and roles. The district ETDM coordinator in Turnpike, that's Rax. He is the administrator over the projects within the Turnpike. So he's the one making sure that the project is uploaded, the purpose and need is there, that the line work looks good, that the preliminary environmental discussions are there. He's doing all of that initial work, and he's the one who officially sends the project out for review and starts off the 45 days to all the state and federal partners as well as the public. When these things are released, while it also goes to the ETAT, I do think it's also important, I talk a little bit later, that there's also a public and the same opportunities. The difference is in a secure site, the ETAT representatives are provided official places, official forms to provide comments and feedback, and then we use that information to help scope out the project in the future. The public has access to the same information, and then they have a spot where they can submit comments or they can request an information meeting. And what that does is that actually opens an email and goes to whoever the ETDM coordinator is, or if they assigned a project manager this early in the process, that person would be listed and that information would go to people. It's not going to a database, it's going to a person for consideration. Also within the districts, we have community liaison coordinators. Their job, and in some districts, it all depends on how they're set up. They may have different people. One might be the ETDM coordinator doing all the administrative stuff. One might be the community liaison coordinator. Some districts we've seen them use the same hat, different hats on the same person. But that person, what they're responsible for is preparing what we call the social cultural effects responses, and their job is to solicit and respond to any public comment. So there's mechanisms, there's locations within the tool that will look at the social cultural effects issues. There's 6 of them, and there'll be a spot where the department, before it goes out, will do a preliminary environmental discussion. So we'll share on, you know, what's the potential social impacts of this project in this area, what are the aesthetic impacts and the other issues. And then there's a spot where you can summarize any public engagement activities that have either happened or are going to happen, so that you can have a spot to document those things. Because again, it's, you know, a core part of this. And then it won't be as often. We did have federal projects that we have a resource assigned, an OEM, that's Matt Marino, and before projects go out officially to the public, the state and the federal partners, they actually complete a pre-screening review where Matt would be looking at your purpose and need, he'd be looking at your preliminary environmental discussions. And part of what we just tell folks, and even if you guys are just doing state projects, here's what I would tell you for sure, that you only have one chance to make a first impression. And so you want to make sure what leaves us and goes out there is really puts us in the best light. It really describes the project in the best light, because once it goes out, it's available forever. It's available on the public sites, things are downloadable, it's out there forever. So we always go by the concept that you only have one opportunity to make a first impression. So we try to do the best that we can. So I won't follow up on that by too much because the federal projects, the other point when it's a federal project is we adopt products, we invite cooperating, participating agencies, we approve class of actions, things like that. So Office of Environmental Management, Matt would be helping Turnpike do that. So that preliminary environmental discussion that I talked about a little bit early was informing agencies and the public for understanding environmental issues. So one of the things that we have always talked with our partners about is the idea that really we want you to tell us what we, either confirm what we know or tell us what we don't know. And we recognized a few years ago we didn't really have a good mechanism of sharing what we know. So about 4 or 5 years ago, we developed the preliminary environmental discussion, which is also reused. They're used for the advanced notifications that go out in programming screen. These preliminary environmental discussions are actually used to support the summary report, but also they become the environmental setting piece of the requirement for the advanced notification. So you do it once and it's actually reused in multiple spots. But this is a way for us to make sure we can kind of set the stage with our partners on, we know our project, we know what's out there, and here's all the things that we're aware of. And then that provides them with some assurances that we do in fact, have the expertise and do actually in many cases know exactly what's going on out there. That gives them some confidence in that, but it also allows them to not go into droves and droves of information relative to this. We used to have some agencies that would cut and paste all of their regulations, like a good 1.5 pages on every single project, and it could be frustrating at times. So some of the things we work with them is we want to know, do they need to be coordinated with? What does that coordination mean? Do they want us to do any technical studies? Which technical studies? And do they anticipate any permits? When an agency logs on, and you'll see in the system, when an agency logs on, or actually when anybody logs on, it knows who you are. It knows what agency you represent. It knows what activities you can perform. It knows what your role is. It knows what your jurisdiction is. So when the Army Corps of Engineers logs in and they're providing this information, the things that they're identifying for coordination and technical studies and anticipated permits is tied to the Army Corps of Engineers. The Coast Guard's on there, it's going to be tied to the Coast Guard. If it's U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, it'll be them. It's just that way within the database to kind of pull and tease out the information that's popular or needed from each one of those agencies. So in that planning screen, what decisions are we talking about? We're looking at, do they understand the purpose and need? Do they have comments about the affected environment? Do they agree with our mode? Are there any critical flaws and any potential controversies? We're working with them, what should we avoid and minimize? That's going to help us develop and refine any potential alternatives and then inform their cost feasible plans. In a programming screen, I said, these are priority projects. We're expecting to begin to work on the environmental document development phase. Because of that, we're actually using activities in these screening events to also kick off some of those activities since we know this is a priority project. So let's do some of the activities that we would traditionally have to wait in PD&E. Let's start that early coordination in this screening event. So we'll send out the advanced notification package. That'll start us with our intergovernmental coordination, our ICAR review. It'll establish our federal assistance if we need it. So the S2424 form, if that's what's actually needed, you guys probably won't use it that often. We'll complete our federal consistency compliance with the Florida Coastal Management Plan. We're working with our partners. They're giving us comments specifically for direct, indirect, and cumulative effects. We're gonna readdress that. There's some recent guidance from CEQ combining all of those things into just effects. So we'll work on that, but the thoughts are still the same, direct, indirect, and cumulative, and even when they pull it all into effects, they still have the definitions for all three of those kind of embedded in the effects definition. But you're building a scope. And you want to make sure that the purpose and need is accepted. If there's any alternatives that can be eliminated before you start the PD&E, you want to be able to do that. And to do that, you got to have, the right documentation and documented coordination and concerns for things to have enough information, enough backing to be able to eliminate those alternatives. It also highlights critical path issues. You know, is there going to be a lot of relocations? That might be a critical path issue for us because we're going to have to acquire that land, and there's a process associated with that. You know, really understanding all that. You're going to get your federal consistency determination, which is also tied to the government comp plan. So this is also going out to through DEP to our state partners, and they're letting us know whether or not the project's consistent with their plans. And then ultimately, all of those things lead to a class of action, a SEER for Turnpike, but could be a type 2, an EA, or an EIS for the federal projects, which Turnpike can still use. They just aren't to date using that much. The results of all of those interactions result in a screening report. So one of the things we traditionally do is we put a lot of information together and we say, here's what we know. We share it with everybody, and then they react and they tell us about all the things that either we do know or we didn't know. They tell us about potential impacts. And at the end of that, after they're reviewing things on our timeline, we also have a timeline to send out a summary report within 60 days of the end of that screening, with the intent being, you know, how do we summarize all these interactions? Because you can have many agencies that are reviewing the same project, even for the same issue, but doing it for a very different reason. So if you think about wetlands, you could have the Army Corps of Engineers, you know, reviewing it. You could have National Marine Fisheries, you could have the service, you could have the water management districts, you could have DEP, and all of those folks may have a component where they're going to provide the department potential impacts, or what we call a potential degree of effect that this project alternative in this location might have on that particular resource. They have an ability to tell us all the way from an enhanced effect, which green is good, all the way up to a potential dispute, like this project shouldn't even move on. There's some significant issues here, we need to talk, and everything sort of in between. And so these ETDM coordinators, working with our consultants and reviewing the materials, we come to a what we call a summary degree of effect, which is intended to be, what does the department think based on, one, what we already knew, and then everything else that now we've become aware of? Are we anticipating that the degree of effect is still very easy? We're going to follow our process. We're going to get through it. We're going to do this technical study. It'll result in everything, or there may be a lot of work. And so we'll create a summary degree of effect. And on the lower part of the form, where you see a project name, and then you see each one of those issues broken out by social and economic, cultural, natural, physical, you'll see that color-coded chart to know that the lower the number is good, the higher the number is more work. Doesn't mean it's bad, it just means it's more work. We got more issues we're gonna have to deal with, which most likely results in more time and more effort to get through the issue. And when you click on each one of those cells that has that coloring, then you can begin to really read what the potential comments were from each of those agencies that supported the selection of that. The summary report also talks about what is the permits and technical studies that we know we're going to need to go forward. It's a summary of any public comments received during that time. Should there ever be any reason to make a commitment, there's a spot where that could be recorded. It's very unusual. I wouldn't tell you to do it. Make commitments in your PD&E. And part of the whole reason for doing all this is we want to make sure that this engagement results in that early coordination. We want to be able to eliminate alternatives when we can. We want to be able to determine the class of action. We want to develop our project scope. And these events, we want them to occur outside of our screening of, or outside of the development of our PD&E document, because the decisions that we can thoughtfully make in that early planning phase are things we won't have to revisit when we get to the environmental document stage. We also have a process here at the end here. It says alternative corridor evaluation process, which helps us look at much larger areas, develop a more rigid set of methodology memorandum, apply that methodology memorandum, and it's a way to eliminate alternatives before going into PD&E for something other than the alternative did not meet purpose and need. For the federal projects, that's a big deal. You can already eliminate project alternatives that do not meet purpose and need, but in order to eliminate a project alternative as a federal project that does, for something other than purpose and need, there's some additional things you need to accomplish. And part of what we do in Florida was we were very proactive when we developed what we call ACE, Alternative Corridor Evaluation Process, which allows us to look at all the requirements to eliminate alternatives and develop a process and a system that documents what we do to that standard so that we can eliminate alternatives that don't meet purpose and need. So how do we do this? And you'll see a lot of the video, or you'll see a lot of the discussion coming up, but we have the environmental screening tool, web-based tool. It's accessible by the departments, accessible by the public, it's accessible by our partners, and it integrates, analyzes, communicates, and informs folks. There's lots of email notifications and access to things. It's all maps-based and analysis reports. You see on the right is social cultural data report, which is looking at the race and ethnicity, the social demographics and stuff. There's map interfaces that allow folks to do stuff. There's detailed reports on potential impacts. You see on the left, the wildlife and habitat. Then there's details that kind of prompt the review by all of those partners. So on the left, you see a notification. That notification says this project is ready for review, and some details for how to do that. On the right upper side, you see projects needing review. So that's sort of the to-do list for those folks that are participating in the process, and they list out what projects they have to review, how many days are left, have they looked at the purpose and need, have they submitted all their issue responses. And all of those agreements that we have with all those ETAD agencies and partners, there's performance measures that are tied to that we give them every quarter. How did they perform? We asked you to do X many things. Did you do X many things on time? And we rate them with percentages. If they happen to be late or miss anything, it docks the percentages and highlights those issues as well. And it just starts that continual conversation on how we make sure folks are engaged and on track and on time. When they are reviewing the project, they look at the project description, the purpose and need, project documentation. They have access to those preliminary environmental discussions that we led. There's also a lot of GIS analysis reports. There's hundreds and hundreds of layers that have been provided by these agencies that they told us how they wanted us to perform analysis, so that when we had line work and it was going to be within a specific buffer distance, or it was going to intersect with something, they wanted the results to be shot out so that the things they cared about would be very visible to them. There's all those different maps. If you remember those environmental considerations, this is what all those agencies are tied to, and depending on who the agency is, you're tied to one or more of these things, and allows you to kind of subset the data to be able to see the things that are relevant for those various issues. They've got some advanced tools. They can ride the road, they can look at developing some complex queries and run measuring tools and all sorts of stuff. The ETAT themselves can do field reviews. They can think about their agency's specific knowledge and any publications that they're aware of. And then they come back in, they identify their resource level, they assess for their direct, their indirect, and cumulative effects, and they identify their potential impact. So you see that no involvement all the way to potential dispute. They provide comments that are specific for purpose and need. So Army Corps is giving us their comments for purpose and need. Army Corps is giving us potential direct and indirect comments. And if they have any cumulative effect considerations, there's that as well. Every agency does this. They just do it from their perspective. What you see on the screen now is the summary of the results. So what during the review, it goes out for 45 days. All of the agencies have an opportunity to review. They all provide their comments, and then we come in and we provide a summary. So what you see on the left is you have 3 agencies that each assigned a different degree of effect. They have different sets of comments. And then below, we assign a degree of effect and we provide our comments, and that results in that high-level chart that you see over on the right-hand side. And then we talk about the secure and the public site. So you just have screenshots for that. So the big difference between the two is just the interface. We can train everybody on the left-hand side, and it's a secure site, and they're drafting their responses, and it may have access to data and information that is publicly exempt. So think about like archaeological sites or threatened and endangered species locations. There's certain sets of data that shouldn't be accessible to the public. And then on the right-hand side, all the same information's there, but we're not actively training all of these users. So it's put in there to be a little simpler to get to. It doesn't require as much thought, and it doesn't have access to data that shouldn't be there. The other thing you guys use is we have an area of interest tool. And so we have all those different data layers, and we have ways that we go out to all those ETAT agencies. But like I said at the very beginning, that only accounts for 15% of the projects that are actually looked at in the department. So there's 85% of the projects completing an environmental evaluation that don't go out and get shared to everybody. So we reuse all those hundreds and hundreds of data layers, and we keep them in an interface that allows anybody in the department who requests access to go in and create a point, a line, or a polygon, and then generate some results, reports, social cultural data. They can look at a cultural report, they can look at an emergency management report, they can run GIS analysis report, and they can, they're developed in PDFs that they can download maps of the area, and they can reuse the existing system to develop these analysis results to support their local environmental evaluation for their specific project. So they develop it, and there's just an example of the types of reports that you could run and an example of what the report would look like. And then, why do we all do this? And I've talked about it. It's just the information advancing to PD&E. So the purpose and need, class of action, if it's federal, you've got cooperating participating agencies. You've got a lot of feedback on your alignments. We've already done a preliminary environmental determination. We've worked to eliminate things if we can eliminate stuff. We also have a good understanding of what anticipated technical studies or permits are. We've got a summary of the public comments or interactions and engagement, social cultural effects evaluation, things like that. We've also identified any future coordination activities, and then recommendations for future phases. And of course, the results of all this may be used in a PD&E study. Part of what we're doing, and it's more on the federal side, is that we've developed a process where you can adopt the planning products. And part of that is it's got to be done in a certain way, and it has to be done within a certain timeline. And so we've set up a system so that we leave this system with a class of action that hopefully feeds directly into development of an environmental document that keeps us on all of those timelines. So I think with that, Ruth, I'm actually going to not do the next slide and just turn it over to you from here. So if you want to grab it.
Okay, thank you.
And I will go on mute, and you should be good. And sorry I lost audio there for, I'm sure it was only like 60
just a couple
seconds.
minutes.
Yeah, it felt like forever. Okay, I'm going on mute. Thank you.
And I am trying to share my screen. Okay, there we go. Thank you. Okay, so Pete talked a lot about what needs to be done, and I'm going to talk more on how to do it, and specifically focusing on the turnpike perspective. First of all, let's just look a little bit at the planning and the programming screens. As Pete mentioned, a lot of the difference between the two is on the focus. In the planning screen, we're developing an understanding of purpose and need. We're focusing on feasibility. Whereas when we move into the programming screen, we're planning on advancing it to PD&E, and we're trying to scope it. We're trying to accept the purpose and need so we don't have to address that in so much detail. We're meeting requirements to send the advanced notification package out. And then in the middle of this, there's a core set of information and tasks and outcomes that we're trying to accomplish. In most cases, we do a lot more programming screens than planning screens. So in this presentation, I'm going to be focusing on the things in this blue circle, and of course, the intersect between the two. So I'll be talking about managing state projects through a programming screen. And I'm pulling information from both the ETDM manual and a little bit from the PD&E manual. The ETDM manual, Chapter 2, provides an overview of the process, and it has the tasks and requirements that cross over both the programming and planning screen. So it's where the common places are. Chapter 3 is about the planning screen, and Chapter 4 has details specific to the programming screen. And then PD&E manual part 1, Chapter 3 has the details about the PED and the advanced notification, because sometimes those are needed for other types of projects as well. So my background is in project management, so I think in terms of a to-do list. So here's our to-do list at a very high level for the ETDM process to get projects through a programming screen. There's 7 basic steps here, and I'm going to go through each one in more detail because, of course, in each one there's multiple steps. So first, identifying the qualifying projects. As Pete mentioned, we're looking at the high-level things with the potential for affecting the environment. But on top of that, there's another level of detail. It's not even every one of those projects. It really depends on the system that it's on and the funding and the responsible agency. So if you look at this chart, and this is in the PD&E manual on page 2-13, you can get some indication of what needs to go through ETDM based on where it is. Like, for example, is it on the SIS? Is DOT responsible, or is it it's local and DOT? Then there's a local option. There's, you may decide to do it or not to do it, and the type of environmental document is likely a SEER. So this chart people find very helpful in the ETDM manual to help them figure out what needs to go through the ETDM process. So I wanted to bring that to your attention. So then the next part is, second task is preparing projects for screening. And this has its own task list because you need to enter the information, review it, develop your PED, prepare your AN, and then check your information before it goes out to the ETAP. So again, a little bit more detail on each of these. The project information that's needed are things like the purpose and need, the project description. You'll indicate so the ETAP knows if this is federally funded, is there a federal permit, what's the involvement. In most cases, yours will be state funded. You indicate the lead agency. For a state project, FDOT is the lead agency. For a federal project, it would be OEM. Exempt agencies are those that don't need to see this. For example, the Coast Guard, if you're in the middle of downtown with no waterways that might be navigable, you could exempt them. So certain agencies that there's no involvement can be exempt from the review. You also upload supporting documents. These may be reports, it may be maps. I know that's one thing that you all usually upload is your own location map because it often having that custom made map is a lot easier for a reader to understand than sometimes on the interactive, something that a computer generates. So you sometimes load up those. Sometimes there's planning reports that might be useful. There might be pictures, things like that to help the ETAT and the public understand the project better. If you've had any public outreach or involvement, there's a place where you can summarize that. So you can give an indication. If, for example, there might be a local agency that you've communicated with, there might be a special interest group that has been involved and has some questions, and you can kind of summarize that involvement that you've had to date. And then, of course, you'll map the features of the project so that it appears on our interactive map, and we can compare it with the GIS information that's available on the environmental screening tool. And there's tools, there's a little wizard to help you go through this process, and forms and different reports that have that in the EST. And we do offer separate training on how to do that. Then once you've loaded your project in, especially getting the line work in there, you can run the GIS analysis in the EST. And as Pete mentioned, there's hundreds of layers. It's over 300 different layers that we have available. And we compile those reports in specific buffers, like a quarter mile, half mile, 1 mile, depending on the resource. So you can look at those. You can look at some of our reports, like our sociocultural data report that's shown here, or we have our cultural resource report, and we have our map viewer that you can look at. You also, don't just limit yourself to the environmental screening tool. We know you know a lot about the environment, you know a lot about your projects. So being aware, your local knowledge, any planning studies, you can rely on that information too, because all of this stuff becomes the basis of your PED, your preliminary environmental discussion. As Pete mentioned, this provides a context, our understanding of the potential environmental issues. It's important to note that it does not include a finding, and it does become part of the advanced notification. There is a separate CBT I wanted to point out here that is available on, that gives you a lot more instructions on developing the PED and the advanced notification. But this is key, whether you're going through a planning or a programming screen. Developing the PED is very important, and it's very well received by our ETAT. We get a lot of good comments that they really appreciate having that information summarized and described for them. They're not just looking at raw GIS data, they're looking at your understanding of the project, and that they can verify or they can add to it, and that's really what we're asking for. This lists the topics that are on the PED, the basic outline. I've noted here in July, we updated the PD&E manual and some of the names changed. So if you do go through that CBT, you might see screenshots or discussions where like something's called water resources. Well, now it's called water quality and quantity. These are basically name changes, but just wanted to make you aware. These are the different topics, and these topics are also what are addressed in the ETAT review, so they comment on the ones under their jurisdiction, and then in PD&E we address it in even more detail. So there's that continuity of information going from the very beginning planning stages through PD&E. So what is the advanced notification package? This is our way of informing our stakeholders of our project. It is required both by federal and state rules. So we have to do it regardless of whether it's a federal or state project. It also initiates consistency reviews to support federal decisions. In many cases, like the federal consistency may not be needed, but in certain cases it may be needed for a SEER, and it's described in the SEER chapter. So how do you prepare it? We have a tool in the EST that helps walk you through that process. You start filling out your PED on here. You do the upload the different pieces that fill it out and create your transmittal list. There are certain transmittal recipients that are required for every project, and those are already loaded in the database. OEM keeps up with those. But if you ever get a response that somebody has changed their email, or something's bouncing back, please let us know. We really appreciate it. I know there was a case just recently where one of the folks who was getting hard copy contacted the project team and said, hey, can you start sending us this electronically, because I'm not going into my office as often and I really want to know about this. So we added them as an electronic recipient. And when these should go out within 4 years of the PD&E start date, so that you don't have to do it again. So the closer to the PD&E start date is the better in terms of the timing of it. The sections of the advanced notification include a cover letter, location maps, fact sheets, application for federal assistance if that's needed, and the transmittal list. And the chapter has examples of these things as well. So next, once you've got all your information prepared, it's really important for the ETDM coordinator and the project manager to review the data and the information for accuracy and completeness, because this will be going out to all of the ETAT. It goes out for the advanced note as part of the advanced notification to even an expanded group of people, and it's made available on our public site. So looking at things like the project description, the purpose and need, the PED, and the mapped features to make sure that they're consistently talking about it and they're correct and accurate. That's a key component, and there's reports and maps available on the EST to help you do that review. And it's actually built into our ETDM process. When somebody finishes entering the data, they actually have to code it that is ready for QA, QC, and then it stays there until the ETDM coordinator says it's ready to go. And at this time, it's also a good time to start initiating some coordination with ETAT members. We have found that it's very effective if you can sponsor a webinar that just kind of announces the project, gives the context, gives the ETAT an opportunity for them to talk to you about the project and what your plans are and what you know about the project. So that right before it goes out, a few weeks before, so that it's fresh on their mind when they get their review notification, they'll have an idea of the project. You'll also be coordinating with the ETAT members during the ETAT review. You'll receive some emails if they have like triggering a dispute, or in some other cases, like if they're saying there's a substantial impact, so you can actually start talking to them ahead of time. And if they have questions, they can be calling or emailing. There's the contact person on the EST for each of the projects, and it can be either the ETDM coordinator or the project manager, and that's the person that they'll be contacting. And then afterwards, you'll be coordinating with them as you develop your summary report. And I'll go into that in a little bit more detail later. So after you've prepared the information, you've done some initial coordination with them, you will send out the notification through the EST. And there's a tool in there to help you build it. And this email goes out to all of the ETAT that are assigned by geographic district. So they're assigned to a geographic area. Some ETAT are statewide, others are more specific, but the EST has them coded as the agency has told us. And so they'll go out to the ETAT. And then, like I said, depending on the transmittal list that you may have added to people in that process of the AN, it'll go to those folks as well. It also CCs the project manager and the ETDM team. And they'll get their notification and they can start their review. And this chapter 4, section 4.5.1 talks about the notifications. And again, like I said, you'll be coordinating with them and getting emails. You don't get email every time they submit some, but if they said they didn't understand the purpose of need or they had a dispute, you will get an email on those so that you could start some initial conversation and maybe get it resolved before that 45-day period is over. Also, keep an eye out for some public input. When you send that notification, that project information is posted to our public site, and whoever's listed as the contact is also listed here. We do not have an interface on the public site to collect comments from the website. We actually prefer that they send them via email to a real person and make sure they don't get lost. So if you're doing any public outreach things, you can also let them know that the information is out here. And you may get some questions. When the review period is over, that's the time to prepare the summary report. And this is a time where, like Pete said, you're pulling together the comments, resolving differences, but you're also starting to identify your potential technical studies and permit needs, or tweaking them if you've already started that just based on their input. Sometimes the ETAT will actually recommend certain things or let you know of specific permit needs. And at this point, you're developing the preliminary programming screen. Notice that there's actually 2 points for the summary report in the programming phase. The preliminary one has the results of the ETAT. After you send that out, you would be responding to any requests for participating in cooperating agencies, which in the case of the SEER usually are not. RACS does a great job of crafting those letters and explaining that we will be coordinating with them, but those official rules are not needed for state projects. You'll have an opportunity to eliminate alternatives if that's applicable. And then you record the class of action determination. In the case of a SEER, that's approved at the turnpike level. If it was a federal class of action, it would go up to OEM for review and approval. And then after that's done, you republish the summary report. And this is then the title changes to Final Programming Screen Summary Report. And that really posts all this additional information that you've done after the preliminary, especially the class of action, so that the ETAT is getting feedback, not just on their comments, but on the decisions moving forward with the project, especially with the class of action. So they'll know for sure, okay, this is a SEER now. And to go into a little bit details about preparing the summary report, I've got an example here that shows some coordinator responses, just to point out that first there's the summary degree of effect, as Pete mentioned. That's where DOT decides, especially if there's differences in opinion with ETAT, what that summary degree of effect is. And then we provide our understanding of the resource involvement. And we respond specifically to ETAT comments. Here's some examples from DEP and South Florida Water Management District and what they indicated and how we will respond to those. And then we provide our summary degree of effect and the rationale of why we chose that. And determining the class of action, we have a form for that as well. And this gives a summary of potential impacts. And there is a PowerPoint training on this up at our website that you may want to refer to for more information. That what this does is it basically is a summary of the summary report. It's just indicating if there's a potential for significant impacts or no involvement. And then at the bottom, you indicate the actual class of action, a SEER, indicate if there's any other these activities. It's identified, because you did that earlier, the lead agency is Florida Department of Transportation, you guys, and there, in this case, there are no participating or cooperating agencies, and then you save and send it, and the environmental manager is the person who will approve it. So both the ETDM coordinator and the environmental manager see it and approve it. And then click the button and it publishes it and sends it out to everybody who received the initial notification. And if the people have changed in the agency, it resolves that. Like if an ETAT member has left and a new one is, the system knows to send it to the new person. Now I'm just going to point out some differences between state and federal. Because of our NEPA assignment that Jason talked about earlier, anything in the ETDM process that FHWA used to do as a lead agency, it's now done by OEM. So what that does is it adds an extra review step before you send out the notification. OEM will pre-screen the review, looking specifically at the PED, the project description, and the purpose and need. And of course, you'll be working with Matt and Mike, your project development engineer, coordinating with them with questions and preparing that documentation. And these are some of the ETDM approvals that are handled by OEM when it's a federal project. So the purpose and need, that will be the one accepting it. If you're going through the ACE process, they concur on the MM and the ACER, and they'll send out, you guys will recommend participating and cooperating agencies, and OEM will actually send the invitations. They also concur on eliminated alternatives and approve the class of action and the adoption of any planning products, which for federal, that's required in order to use the planning products. They need to be adopted officially to be used for PD&E. There's also some additional coordination and supporting documentation needed. For example, I mentioned the federal consistency reviews. The planning consistency is more detailed requirements, and participating cooperating agencies more likely, not always required, but likely, and most likely you'll have some additional corridors or alternatives to review depending on the context of that project. So how do we use this summary report to support PD&E? We have a chapter in the ETDM manual, chapter 5, that talks about advancing to PD&E, and a lot of this information is found there. Pete already mentioned all of these outcomes that can be used to support PD&E. These are all located in the summary report. So it's an easy document to use to help provide information to through the project life cycle to the next in line. Some of the things that it's used, as I mentioned, the input summary information from the ETAT and from your PEDs, and all the data that you have access to can assist with the class of action, and the level of analysis and the focus for your SEER. For example, through coordination with an agency, you may find that a certain element doesn't need studied as much, and something else might need more. So you can focus your PD&E scope using that input. And it also helps and supports the environmental scoping process and focuses the analysis that you need before, like you might need to do some technical studies before you initiate the PD&E, and then it also helps focus them in PD&E. We also wanted to point out that while you're in PD&E, you may have some documents that you want to send to all or some of the ETAT members. For example, you might have your natural resource evaluation report that you want to send to the wildlife agencies for their review, or just even to just give it to them. And certain documents that you're asking them for some concurrence or some feedback on, you can send it through the environmental screening tool using our document review module. Through this module, you can set up the event. It asks you a few questions about, like, is it a new event? When do you want it to be? Is it about an ETDM project? Because it doesn't have to be an ETDM project. You can send these documents out for review, and who will be included in it. If you say ETAT, you can either say all your ETAT or specific agencies, and you can pick other and just put your own other email addresses in. And then it walks you through this wizard that's shown here on the right, where you enter different details about the documents, about the event, and you can send the notification or schedule it to go out. And then they review, they comment, they submit their comments on the document review module. And so they're all in one place for you. And then you can compile those results as needed. So with that, we have pretty much gone through our ETDM steps. Does anybody have any questions?